start of Ignite 2019. This is the first year we're giving lightning talks an official try for our program. Just to kind of give you a format of what the students will be doing today, is each student team will get up and give about a 10-minute talk on research they have conducted here at St Thomas Aquinas College. Once they're done, we'll have all members who have presented to come up to the front of the room and then answer any questions you will have about their research. Once we're done with all the questions, then we'll have food and wine over in Costello Hall in the art gallery as well as upstairs. All right? And then right at 4 o'clock is when we will begin poster presentations officially. Okay? So with that, I'd like to invite up to the stage first Isabella Diaz. Her faculty member for this research talk was Dr. Megan DeWitt, and her title for today's talk is Swarms and Group Theory. Please welcome Isabella.
Good afternoon, and thank you for attending my discussion regarding the similarities between swarms and algebraic group theory. Recently, with the guidance of my professor, Dr. Megan DeWitt, I have been conducting research in attempts to explain the similarities between swarms in nature and algebraic group theory. Many of these biological groups exhibit behaviors that may be able to be connected by the guidelines of group theory. These behaviors include a maximum and a minimum, distance between group members, and a collective between them, such as direction of movement. We investigate the group-like structures of swarms and seek to develop how these structures work with each other by taking advantage of the similarities between the groups. The symmetrical tendencies between these behavioral patterns are crucial in understanding the way that swarms operate. I will start off with a general introduction into swarms and then dive into group theory and their possible relationship. A swarm is a collective behavior of organisms moving together. Swarms exist in almost every category of the animal kingdom. However, this term typically refers to insects, while flocking is used for swarms. Oh, I'm sorry. However, however, this term typically is used for insects, while flocking is used for swarm behavior in birds. Herding is used for four-legged animals, and schooling for fish. For simplification, I will refer to the behavior, regardless of the species, as a swarm. Animals swarm for various reasons. Swarming is an important part of the annual life of honeybees. For example, when a hive of honeybees is too populated to be sustainable, the honeybees swarm in order to find new branches to settle on. Starlings, a type of bird that's very common in the United States, swarm as they travel between feeding grounds in a form of protection against predators. Krill use the same tactic to deter fish from eating them. However, this strategy has now caused them to become an easy meal for baleen whales, since the whales can now eat tons of krill in one easy gulp. Another one of the more common uses for swarms are for hunting purposes. Herons are not nimble enough to catch prey on their own, so they use swarming techniques to become a more strategic predator. Swarms can have rapid movement and instantaneous direction change. Meanwhile, their members never break formation or collide. In order for a species to form a swarm, they have to have a certain distance range. The animals have to be close enough in order to swarm so they know what's going on, but they also can't be too close or else they will collide. Once an organism does swarm, there is no individual leader. This emergent behavior originates from the simple rules followed by the participants instead of central coordination. The participants follow their neighbors, hence the lack of individual leader. For example, when starlings swarm, they act in accordance with about 7 of their closest neighbors. These swarms often contain millions of birds and form incredible shapes. When the swarm is formed, the animals can move in one of 3 main directions. The basic one is referred to as a swarm or a cloud. The organisms in these are constantly attracting and repelling each other, resulting in disorganized movement. The next is classified as a torus or a whirlpool, and this phenomenon results in a circular behavior. The most sophisticated form is a flock, and this occurs when animals align themselves in a single direction. Locust swarms are notorious of this. Moving on to group theory. This is the field of mathematics that studies the concepts of groups and is often simplified as the study of symmetry. For my understanding of group theory, I relied heavily on Nathan Carter's algebraic group theory. we decided that the group theory was one of the best options for swarm movement opposed to the traditionally used differential equations because there were many similarities between the properties of swarms and groups. Swarms fulfill the requirement of there being a predefined list of outcomes because there are basically two options. Animals can swarm or they can't swarm. This also ties in with a deterministic condition. Also, every move is considered reversible because once a swarm is created, it does not exist forever. Animals can swarm, break apart, move on, and then come back again. The last one, that actions can be combined in any sequence, is not an exact fit. The end result will always be the same with regards to swarm number in any position. However, due to the existence of distance inequalities, not all elements can be combined, so that limits the orders that the swarms can be formed in. So there are 4 laws to group theory. The first is closure. It is defined as if A and B are in a group, then A times B is also in the group. Next is associativity. So if A, B, and C are in the group, then B times C is equal to A and B times C. The third is identity, which means that there exists an element I in the group, where I equals A and B times I equals B and A, and so on. Lastly are inverses. This is defined for any group of the element, and that there is an element inverse that would equal to I. These fundamentals of group theory sound similar to the behaviors of swarm, leading to the idea that there is a group-like structure of swarms. The interactions of swarms has enough correlation to the 4-part definition of group theory, which is the reason for this research. Closure exists because the possibility for all animals to interact with each other, because there's the possibility for all animals to interact with each other, and the possibility of them either staying separate or swarming together. The next is associativity. Here you can see my proofs for this aspect. We had some difficulty with this aspect, which I will dive into later. However, since it does not fully obey associativity, it's more like a quasi-group than an exact group. And since it does have an identity, which is almost like a loop. Identities can be described as the black diagonal you see across there. Mm-hmm. And since an animal cannot swarm with themselves, this is the A to A interaction that would be considered the identity. Another example of the identity are the cells marked separate. This is because the difference between the two does not fall in between the distance elements, and that means that the animals would remain unchanged. However, the problem with the rise is that it's not in the unique group. And then there are 2 different identities with this. And then the first is how animals cannot swarm with themselves, and the second is how they are in the avoided area. I started off my research with a simple number line. My goal was to start with one-dimensional scenarios and work my way up. I would place 4 hypothetical organisms on a random distance and name them A through D. I then assigned them a swarm number, a position, and a position. And then I arbitrarily came up with inequalities to determine the distance required to start the swarms. With this example, I made the requirement to be greater than 2 but less than 4. If their distances were not within this range, they would remain separate entities. I placed the outcomes of the operations into the multiplication table you can see there. However, I needed to block out the interactions with themselves, hence the identity property. And I decided to follow the information of each cell into a multiplication table. I would label the potential swarm to distinguish it from the other. When animal A would swarm with animal B, then their swarm would be named AB. Then I recorded the swarm number. This was a single action swarm, not simultaneous, so all swarm numbers increased to 2. Lastly, the following is that the 2 entities would meet in the middle, and I would record their placement along the number line. If 2 animals did not exist within the distance requirement, I marked them as separate, and I used color coordination to aid in the process of looking for visual patterns. For original elements A through D, I gave them more of a basic color, and then when their swarms combined, I tried to combine their colors too. And this allows for easy identification of the closure property, and once we get into higher dimensions, the associative property. And once I became more comfortable with my tracking procedure, I decided to do more research on the movements with each element. I changed the number lines from containing 4 organisms to 3, and I continued the process into a second combination. I noticed that when I started the original combination from the left side, I got a different ending position than when I started it from the right. I also noticed that the total distance traveled by all the elements had changed, and it depended on which side that I started on. This would mean that the groups were not acting as they should under the associativity law. I thought that this process could have been arising because I was simply averaging the distances. In real life examples, once a swarm is large enough, the new members travel to it instead of them meeting in the middle. This reminded me of the center of mass formula. I changed the inputs into ones that correlated with this topic, position, and quantity. By doing this, my examples began to arise at the same ending location. However, I was still having the problem of varying distances. I tracked the movement of the variables and found that the adjustment equals c minus 2a plus b divided by 2. I hope through further analysis to discover the significance of this difference, and I've also developed formulas to determine total distance traveled for a collection of these elements with two-step swarming. My goal is to use the same process with increasingly complex numbers and scenarios to search for possible patterns. Here are the list of formulas that have arisen during my research. We have here. The plans for the future of this research are to incorporate them into actual swarm figures and more complex multiplication tables. There are many applications once we formulate a concrete relationship between swarms and group theory. We could gain insight onto flocking patterns and quite possibly even predictive tools. One of the most important uses would be to better understand locust destruction and have control over it. Africa and the Middle East have experienced great devastation by locust swarms. In 1954, Morocco lost over $50 million in only 6 weeks because of damage and Ethiopia lost enough grain to feed 1 million people for a year in 1958 due to a locust swarm. Developing countries like this cannot sustain consistent loss from locust swarms, which would further emphasize the need for understanding their movement. Through my research, I've come across numerous scholarly articles that mention that scientists are looking into swarm behavior to formulate more effective methods for targeting cancer therapy. The idea is that if anti-cancer drugs can be developed with swarm intelligence, they can become more effective in completing their tasks the same way that animals in nature do when they swarm. This research has been a wonderful process for me, and I'm very honored to have this platform to share it with you. Thank you for your time.
As I said, we'll take questions at the very end for all presenters officially. Next up, we have Rob Milberger. His faculty mentor was Dr. Bianca Wenzel. The title of his talk is Microplastic Accumulation in Wetlands of the Scarfield Watershed.
That's not enough.
If you could please silence your cell phones, please, as well. Thank you.
All right, before we begin, I just want to take this opportunity to thank, sorry, 1 second. Yeah. Before I get started, I just want to take this opportunity to thank the entire science department. Projects like this, they require a lot of collaboration from a lot of different experts. So thank you to Dr. Dent, Dr. Burns, Dr. Wynn, Professor Holt, and of course Dr. Wenzel, my mentor. So up front here, I've got a couple different plastic products: paper bag, polyester T-shirt, a water bottle, some packaging used for food. And so, if not recycled properly, all of these plastics, in one way or another, will make their way into our environment, and they will be broken down slowly over time through sunlight, microbes, and just the physical movement as they move through the environment. They'll be broken down into smaller and smaller pieces, which we now refer to as microplastics. Now, microplastics, as the name implies, are plastics that are smaller than 5 millimeters in length. And they've been plaguing our oceans for the past several decades, as you can see here and here. And they've been washing up on our shores. And at one point, we actually used them in some cosmetic products called as microbeads, figured here. But actually, recently, I think in the past 5 or so years, we've outlawed them because of the ecological harms associated with them. And when we're talking about the ecological harms associated with microplastics, it really comes in two separate categories. There is the actual problem of when animals accidentally ingest these plastics because they mistake them for food. It can cause serious gastrointestinal problems, blockages that can lead to death in the organisms. And even at lower order species like plankton, daphnia, you can have lower reproductive rates, which can cause even further problems within the food chain. And then additionally, the secondary problem is associated with organic pollutants. So all waterways, to some extent, have pollutants inside of them. And normally, this is not a problem. However, microplastics actually have the ability to allow these pollutants to adhere to the surfaces of the plastics. And so when they're consumed by organisms at all levels of the food chain, they actually work their way back to us and to other organisms, and they have some toxicological problems. And so what we wanted to do in this study was we wanted to answer a couple questions. First being that we wanted to understand what areas in our local community have the greatest accumulation of microplastics, specifically along the Sparkill Creek. Additionally, we wanted to know what polymers made up the plastics that we found, because we wanted to know what types of macroplastics, the bigger plastics, that are contributing to the accumulation of these microplastics in our environment. And then lastly, we wanted to know what is the range of microplastic sizes, because as I mentioned before, different organisms and species are going to be affected differently by different sizes. And so we selected 3 different wetlands within our local area. Wetlands are very, very good at filtering out water. They actually act as natural water filters for our environment. So if you want to go looking for plastics that are being filtered, this kind of environment, this kind of ecosystem makes for an ideal place to go looking for them. And so our first site was Tacamac Park. It's on top of the Closet Mountain here, and the whole series of our sites follows along the Sparkill Creek, which goes from here and it kind of goes loops down into northern New Jersey, where it comes back around and terminates in the Piermont Marsh. Our second site was the Stack Athletic Fields, which is just down the road here. Some of you probably passed by it at some point. And then lastly was the Piermont Marsh, which is the terminal wetland within our local watershed. This is where all waterways within our watershed will actually terminate and finish out. And so we went about this in more or less 2 phases. First, we need to actually recover the microplastics. So what we did is we went to each site individually, and we took sediment samples using a handheld auger. And so we took sediment samples, and then we allowed them to dry overnight, and then we placed them into a sieve like this. And what this sieve does is basically just it's a series of different pans with different sized meshes, and these meshes allow for particles of smaller and smaller sizes to fall downwards into, so the smallest particles or plastics will be found at the bottom of the sieve, where the bigger ones would be at the top. And so this allowed us to classify the size of the microplastics based on which sediment fraction they were found in. Next, we needed to degrade any organic material like leaf litter, twigs, things of that nature, in order to allow for the next step, which was to separate microplastics from now degraded organic material, sediment. And so microplastics, because of their density and the density solution that we use, they would float in solution, which could then be filtered out and separated using a dissecting microscope. And then came the next portion, where we needed to actually identify the polymers that made up these different microplastics. And so we used a technique called spectroscopy, which is just a way to find out the chemical makeup of unknown materials based on how they absorb infrared light. And so when you place an unknown material into an IR machine, it gives you back a spectra. And so in this case, there's a couple spectra featured here associated with polyethylene, polypropylene, polystyrene, polytetrafluoroethylene. And so part of what we wanted to do when we went to each site was understand the sediment makeup that we were working with. And so when you analyze a sediment, when you analyze the sediment composition, there's really three main particulars, which is sand, silt, and clay. And what we did to analyze that is we took a sample from our sediment, placed it in a 100 milliliter graduated cylinder, flipped it over a couple times, allowed it to resettle, and what it does is it actually settles out into three different layers. So you've got mostly sand here, clay, silt, and then clay at the top. And so this allowed us to understand the kind of sediment that we were working with. So what we found was that the Piermont Marsh had the greatest amount of microplastic fragments by weight. And it wasn't even, and as you can see by this table, it really wasn't even close compared to the other two sites. And this makes sense considering that since the Piermont Marsh is the terminal wetland in the watershed, all waterways within the watershed, which are being exposed to microplastics every day, they're going to at some point have the possibility of working through the Piermont Marsh, which you could think of it, and also it's also has some benefits if you want to look at the overall health of the Hudson River, because it's preventing microplastics to actually work their way out of the Hudson River and eventually out into the ocean. Additionally, the most common polymer that we found was polypropylene, and we found it at every single site. And polypropylene is associated with materials like rope, bottle caps, carpeting, and then we found additional polymers like polyethylene, polyethylene wax, polystyrene, as well as some other miscellaneous plastics. But as you'll notice over here, in addition to their materials, we also have their recycling numbers. So if you look at the bottom of a bottle, the bottom of some of these packaging, you'll see a recycling number which tells you how to categorize it and sort it. And what this kind of tells us is that all these plastics that we found at one point had the opportunity of being recycled, but they weren't. And so they ended up in our waterways and into these wetlands. And so the last thing we were looking at was microplastic sizes. And so what we found was that there was no size range that stood out across all three sites. And so what this tells us is that there is an equal probability, if you were to take a microplastic from any of these sites, there's an equal probability that will be within any of these size ranges, which tells us that all levels of the food chain are subject to the harms associated with microplastics. So lastly, as I said, the Piermont Marsh is a terminal wetland, and so it's not the only terminal wetland along the Hudson River, as well as in the world. And so it's important for us to keep in mind that there might be other ecosystems out there that are at risk, that are similar to the Piermont Marsh. So as you can see here, here is the Piermont Marsh, and you can see all the waterways within the watershed that terminate out there. And then additionally, polypropylene, like I said, was the most common microplastic that we found. And I think that it's important that we just start to think about how we relate to our stuff, our plastic stuff. Because there are some things that I think we can just live without. Straws, plastic bags, excessive packaging, things like that. I think that nobody's going to be, the world won't end if we stop using plastic straws and we start using paper straws. And it is feasible that one day somebody will do a similar sediment composition analysis like this, and they'll see sand, they'll see silt, they'll see clay, and they'll see microplastics. These microplastics, they don't break down. There's no sign of them breaking down anytime soon. So all the ones that are already in our oceans, already in our waterways, they're kind of there forever, more or less, because we can't walk around. We can walk around and we can organize pickups. We can organize, like on Earth Day, we go around and we can have cleanups and we can pick up trash on the side of the road. We can't take a magnifying glass and tweezers and pick these up, right? So, but I think that maybe through hopefully some legislative changes and a shift in our cultural mindset, we might be able to address this problem before it overwhelms us. Thank you.
Okay, last but certainly not least, we have a team of Alexander Ruzi and Matthias and Trenta. Their faculty mentors were Dr. Megan Mihal and Dr. Roslyn Tredabila. The title of their talk is Relationship Between Capacity Utilization and Inflation Becomes More Evident. You didn't see it.
So before we start, we'd like to give another special thanks to Dr. Mihal and Dr. T for all their help, and another special thanks to Algebraic. He can't be here today, but he was a big part of this paper also. So I guess we'll begin. Prior to the early 2000s, research supporting a causal relationship between capacity utilization and inflation hasn't been prevalent. However, based on recent data, we see evidence to support that this has changed and that the relationship does exist between the two.
After participating in the Federal Reserve Bank of New York College Fed Challenge and researching economic indicators and monetary policy, we noticed a visual trend between capacity utilization and the Cleveland CPI. We decided to further explore this possibility of a linear relationship between the two. The recent shifts between existing between capacity utilization and inflation, as the circumstances between the measurements and their relationship has changed with the natures and the economy as a whole. The recent shift is said to be brought on by technological advances and new monetary policy tools and reactions to changes in said policy. The graph here portrays Cleveland CPI on the left axis in orange and capacity utilization on the right axis in blue since the 1990s. If you can imagine shifting the orange line, the CPI, back almost a year, the two would follow almost side by side with respect to their volatilities. This is where the idea to research a better indicator for inflation with a stronger relationship than employment originally. As you can see, the upward inflationary pressures do seem to have a stronger relationship with capacity utilization, but the downward pressures do not have the same magnitude of similarity.
So, Tysinger has noted how structural shifts in labor markets tend to allow for questions to arise in the accuracy of the relationship between capacity utilization and inflation. Tysinger does believe that the relationship between the two exists, but it is stronger when capacity constraints are reached and prices are raised. Garner has forecasted if a rapid increase of real output is seen in the future, it may cause competition for productive resources. And this competition will lead to an upward pressure on wages and other production costs, which will increase consumer price index. Giddings stated how, like the unemployment rate, the capacity utilization rate can be interpreted as a measure of excess demand pressures facing an economy. Therefore, inflation is likely to increase when demand is strong and capacity constraints become important. Giddings also discusses short-run movements in the capacity utilization rate can be attributed to changes in industrial production because the level of capacity grows at a consistent rate in the long run. Dotsey and Stark indicate how changes in capacity utilization tend to precede fluctuations in inflation, as represented from the data sampled during the 1970s recession. In addition, Emery and Chang produced results outlining the relationship and how it has maintained a strong correlation from the 60s to the 90s. However, the findings mentioned before by Tysinger and Gardner support the argument of capacity utilization and inflation having a stronger relationship now than in the past. All sources, though, still agree that capacity utilization is a leading indicator of inflation. Because of this, capacity utilization is lagged by 1 year. So this is saying, like what she said before, if you move the two, they will line up. Castu explained how some economists believe policymakers may be helping the economy if they were to enact a policy that would induce inflation, since the relationship of the two is positive. Central banks would have to decrease interest rates to increase the supply of money, causing an increase in consumer spending and an increase in inflation. Madden provided the idea of capacity utilization relying more heavily on the firm's decision-making process. In the same way firms can decide to hire more workers for the same wage or increase existing workers' wages, firms can also make decisions between their employable fixed and variable costs of production factors. This would suggest that while monetary policymakers could use interest rates to influence economic growth, as stated by Casu, they cannot accurately predict how firms will act after the policy is put into play. Sorry, I have one job.
For many years, the Phillips curve was used to define inflation by output or the unemployment rate. However, there have recently been many claims that the Phillips curve is dead and that there's continuous debate over this topic. We have seen a change in the recent economic conditions where the labor force participation rate declined to historically low levels and the number of discouraged workers rose to historically high levels, indicating that we were in uncharted territory. This structural shift in the labor market puts the accuracy of the information, that is, the unemployment rate as an indicator of inflation, into question. We examined several other indicators to test if there is a more positively related indicator for the current conditions. Here we concluded that the given shift in the economic conditions, capacity utilization may be a stronger demand variable than unemployment because capacity utilization captures the relative level of output and the aggregate slack in the economy, which unemployment fails to do. The traditional Phillips curve is no longer the most important indication of inflation. For our model, we introduce capacity utilization as an independent variable in determination of inflation. We look similarly to the way the Phillips curve does. However, we use capacity utilization instead of unemployment to our model. We presume that the relationship we see between capacity utilization and inflation is direct, opposed to the inversion of the Phillips curve.
So here's our basic regression model using the least squares method for our sample period of January 2010 to December 2018. CPI is the Cleveland Consumer Price Index. Sorry, it's a mouthful. CAP-UT is capacity utilization, and UR is US U3 unemployment. The number of flags were chosen by minimizing the Akaigi information criteria from various different scenarios and comparing the results of each. The 8-month flags chosen from the AIC results are also relevant outside of their calculated assumptions due to the different variables within the indicators themselves and the way in which they are measured. After running our basic regression, we then examined the residuals using a Jacques-Barra test in order to determine if the residuals were normally distributed. Based on the results from the JB p-value of 0.9081, we failed to reject our null hypothesis at the 95% confidence level. In addition to minimizing the AIC and conducting the Jacques-Barra test, the standard errors surrounding serial correlation and heteroscedasticity were corrected for using White's heteroscedasticity test in addition to the Newey-West methodology. The coefficient beta 2 on the lagged capacity utilization variable is significant at the 5% level, indicating that capacity utilization helps forecast inflation over the entire sample. So basically everything we worked for has worked out.
Displayed on the chart are the descriptive statistics for the variables in the original test used to determine which was the strongest correlation to inflation. For our model, we used Cleveland CPI year over year, and core PCE as the endogenous variables or measures of inflation against capacity utilization, U3 unemployment, and wage growth as our exogenous variables or indication of future inflation. As comparing our descriptive statistics, the Jacques-Barra p-values, skewness, kurtosis, and deviations, we determined that a model using the Cleveland CPI as our dependent variable and capacity utilization against an unemployment rate as our independent variables met the criteria of an OLS regression model. Here we have the estimated Newey-West regression that's with the substituted coefficients for each of the variables. After comparing the p-values, it is clear that the capacity utilization lagged 8 months with a probability of 0.0143 of an alpha of 0.05. We reject the null hypothesis at the 95% confidence interval and the R squared of 0.7072 we can describe as a 70% casual relationship. Our empirical results show that the relationship between capacity utilization and the impact on inflation vary depending on the measurement of inflation and the lagged section of criteria. It also tells us that the relationship for unemployment has severely declined, where capacity utilization is becoming increasingly more statistically significant, indicating its potential use as an estimator of future inflationary pressures.
You guys will like this. this is the short version. In short, we can say that there does appear to be a positively correlated relationship between capacity utilization and inflation. Applications of these findings can prove to be very important to analysis and policymakers as U3 and NAIRU's, the natural rate of unemployment, their effect on inflation may become less prevalent as trends with capacity utilization increase. The relation, that's, yeah, sum it up, yeah, reading it.
And then here are our references and sources mentioned within our research. And we just wanted to thank you for coming to see our presentation about the relationship between capacity utilization and inflation.
If all my presenters would come on up now to the front of the room, and what we'll do now is we'll take questions from the audience regarding the research that was officially presented. So are there any questions? Yeah, no, sorry. Dr. Dunn.
For that last one, your last table with the standard errors, why was the C variable so much higher in the standard error than everything else?
Well, that is a great question. Alex Bruzzi did that chart, and he is not here today. So, unfortunately, I cannot answer that. But when we ran our regression model, we did have a 70% significance level, which is saying that 70% of the time capacity utilization will lead inflation. So that's usually, Dr. T liked to say, he's seen people write on a 10% significance level. So a 70% significance level really just proves that it was right. I'm sorry I couldn't answer your question though.
Any other questions? Dr. Fitzpatrick?
I hate to ask about the Corinth little containers. So they're kind of worse than even these water bottles and stuff. And,
The quart containers?
you know when you make coffee in the single pod, the pot.
Oh, yeah. I mean, the way I look at it is, do we absolutely need that? I mean,
No.
there was a time before when we used to have filter
Right.
papers right for our coffee.
Right.
And I think, I even had to stop the other day. I think most of us, from the moment we were born, have been touching plastic every single,
Right.
Our toys when we were kids. Every day we touch our phones, I don't think there's been a single day in my entire life where I haven't touched plastic. And so I think the best that we can do, because it would be impossible to say, stop using plastic, because
Right.
it's everything, and so I think the best we can do is form a system where we manage it well as we cut down on the unnecessary uses, which most of the time it's for convenience sake, is where we have serious overuse of it, like with plastic, one-use plastic utensils, things like that.
So when we do recycling of all these plastics, is it just a waste of time?
No, it's not a waste. It's not a waste of time in that, like, it's either going there or it's going to the environment.
Right.
It's going out in the environment where it can be broken down and have all the different harms
Right.
I spoke about. So.
Yes, question?
Thanks for your presentation. Thanks for your presentation. It's really good. I want to know where water bottles kind of shake out in terms of microplastics.
Yeah, so every plastic is different as far as how it breaks down. So polyethylene, plastic bags, I mean, they tear, you can just with your hands tear them apart, right? So you think about that moving through the environment, and that breaks down very easily. The sunlight is a big part of like what breaks down the chemical structure. So water bottles are made out of I think it's, I can't remember, it's PET. And it's more, I mean, you've filled a water bottle before at some point, I assume, and they're a more sturdier plastic. But yeah, they can break down, like I said, and some plastics break down at different rates than others. Some are a lot faster. It really comes down to the strength of the plastic. And compared to, I guess, like I said, plastic bags, they're strong, water bottles are stronger than that. But then there's some other plastics that are like more or less indestructible, like they're designed not to break. So those will take a lot longer to break down.
Yes, Dr. Burke.
Hello. Put on your swarming hat.
Oh, no.
No. Did you, were you able to use a software or a simulation to run some of your,
No, that's actually a
analysis?
really good idea. We started off just using like basic variables to come up with a simple model, but I need like actual swarm data, and that's been a really hard thing to come up with. And I think a lot of computer programming would maybe help bridge that gap, so it is a good idea, and that's something I can definitely look into.
Thank you. Dr. Durkis.
Rob, in your listing of the types of plastics,
Yeah.
the one that was most prevalent, I noticed it said rope.
Yeah.
And I forget the other two things.
Yeah, bottle caps, yeah.
Bottle caps
Mhm.
and carpet.
Yeah.
And it made me wonder, I'm a boater, and I boat in all these
Yeah.
areas here.
Mhm.
And I thought it was interesting that it was rope, because maybe one of the reasons that was what we see is because that's what is so prevalent in and around these waterways. I was surprised. I
Yeah.
expected it to be the garbage and things like that.
Yeah, so rope is interesting because it's a fiber, and actually a lot of our clothes nowadays are made of synthetic fibers like polyester. And so when you do your laundry and you put clothing like that into your washer, it actually doesn't. It gets those fibers, they get pulled apart, and they don't actually get processed very well when they go to water treatment plants. And they're one of the biggest. They're one of the biggest contributors to this problem because it's very hard to find nowadays materials that don't utilize some form of a synthetic nylon or polyester.
So when it said rope, it really
Yeah,
was
rope.
fabric. Like,
Yeah.
that is clothing, not marine rope or something.
Well, there is that as well. So there are different kind of ropes can be made out of different plastics depending on their uses. So yes, some ropes can be made out of polypropylene, but then there's others that can be made out of nylon and different plastics and different materials. It depends on what the desired use of the product is.
If I can just interject real quick, just to help with answering that. So nylon and polyester would be different types of plastic.
Yeah.
So the polypropylene that he did find was perhaps rope.
Yeah.
We would have to do some further testing to figure out if that is exactly what it was.
Or clothing, or all these different fibers.
Clothing would be polyester, which we didn't find, at least in this analysis,
Mhm.
or nylon. Those are the main ones which we didn't find.
Yeah.
So yeah.
So maybe it's the fact that
Yeah, it definitely could be the rope
there's
used
a
for
movement
boating
in-
purposes.
There's a movement in boating to switch from those kinds of ropes.
Yeah. They break down fairly easily under sunlight.
Yeah.
So those fibers could get into the waterways. I don't mean to.
No, thank you.
Dr. Craig Martin.
My question is for Rob first. Thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
I was curious, do you know if, like, worldwide, the percentage of plastics that are created that end up used by consumers at the end of the manufacturing process versus those used during the manufacturing process? Do you know, like, what percentage are used by us at the end and what percentage are used along the way before it gets to us? And then secondly, do you know what percentage of the microplastics in the oceans are from end users or from the manufacturing processes themselves?
I think, no, the short answer is no. I don't know the exact answer to that, but overall the process is more or less about, like, is your question like manufacturers, how do they handle their plastics? Is that part? That I don't know. I think the bigger source of these microplastics is the consumer, if I had to narrow it down, because I think in industry they're all about efficiency. They don't want any waste. Whether or not there might be like scrap plastic for whatever production you have, how they manage that, I'm not sure. Hopefully they are recycling, but as far as how industry manages their own plastic use, I'm not sure. I do know that of like the plastic that does get used by consumers, I think about 60% of it doesn't get recycled. It ends up in this case in the environment where it does break down over time into smaller and smaller pieces.
A question for each of you, actually. Could you talk a little bit about how you got interested in each of your research projects, and on top of that, are you planning on continuing any of this research into the future?
I guess I'll start. Okay. So, like Bella said earlier, we did the College Med Challenge last semester, and in doing so, and really utilizing the Bloomberg terminals, we wouldn't have been able to do any of the paper without the terminals. We had noticed the relationship between capacity utilization and inflation, and I think she had even showed me the video today of when Dr. T had realized, oh hey, there's a relationship here, there's a paper behind this, you guys are gonna do it, and we were like, well, how do you say no to that? So it did take a lot of work. It took a long time because we did have to focus on Fed Challenge first. That came first and foremost, and then once that was done, it was like, all right, you think you're done living in Bloomberg, get back in there and finish this paper. So it really did take a lot of time. It's kind of our baby. it's very hard to understand and comprehend, and it even took us a lot of frustrating trial and error to know what we were talking about. But now that we've seen this trend, I think it's something super important. It's something that even the Federal Reserve Bank should know of. And there's other research papers that we saw at the EEA that other students were like planning on writing papers on it too. As far as following up on it, I would, as studying economics, I'd like to see if this relationship continues, especially because we're a very capital-heavy country. We use a lot of capital instead of labor, so capacity utilization is measuring whether we reach those capacity constraints or not, and when they aren't reached, inflation will rise a year later. And so I think that this is something that's going to keep moving forward in the future, and I'd like to see if that trend continues.
And then for my swarms, last year I went to Dr. DeWitt and said, I want to do research and I have absolutely no idea what to do. And she was like, here's this article about swarms and buy this book on group theory. And I was like, okay. And then I read the book and definitely you can see there's so much more I can do with this. And taking it with actual data is probably the next step and going to be the hardest one. But I'm really looking forward to that.
And I think that kind of led me to this was kind of two things. One, I'm really interested in conservation. I think if we don't have an earth, if we don't have a planet, if we don't take care of what we have, we can't produce capital, we can't produce labor if people don't have food, if all the animals are dying for whatever reason. So I was very interested in some kind of conservation research project. Additionally, I was interested in a research project overall because conducting research is a long, strenuous process, and it takes time to figure out how to use the scientific method, right? And it's not just, I'm gonna go take some samples and do this, and I'm gonna do some math and make it kind of work. No, there's a step-by-step process where you need to be very detail-oriented to make sure that you're not making any mistakes, that when you go to relay your information to your colleagues, that you have got good information, that you can back it up. And that's a process that, as a student of science, that that's a skill I wanted to have. And so, yeah.
I've got a question. I'm curious. How has your research affected what you plan to do after you graduate from the college?
Tremendously.
How?
Well,
how does it influence your plans?
I honestly didn't even know what economics really was until I came to college. Then taking micro and macro, I wanted to make it my minor. That challenge made me more aware of how the U.S. economy actually works and runs, and I think it's something so important that's overlooked. And I would really love to go into economics in the future. Maybe finance, probably more economics. And thanks to doing research like this, I really have a good understanding of how it works and the run through of it all.
And then I guess mine's kind of in the middle of what I'm studying. I guess in my two, I got one more biology and math, very sciencey, and then another one very business, and my degree actuarial science is kind of right in the middle. So I kind of like how both of them are pulling me either way. That's why I'm staying in the middle and experiencing everything instead of going one way or the other. But yeah, I know it definitely makes me know I like math, and I like how it can be used in many different applications.
So I at one point plan on applying to some medical schools, and I feel like I do want to do medical research at some point in my life. And like I just mentioned, research is a process it's a skill, and you need to learn how to process it and learn how to do literature research, learn how to do your background information, formulate a hypothesis, test methods, talk to people, communicate between other people who have other different ideas, even if they conflict with you. And I think that those are good skills to have that I want to carry forward as I move through my career.
Any other questions? How about a round of applause for